Okay, everybody, welcome back to our third and final session today. I'm joined with our speaker, Dr. Karen Alter-Reid. So, Karen is a clinical psychologist who specializes in working with adults struggling with post-traumatic stress injuries. She trains mental health clinicians in Emgr Therapy, a modality of treatment for PTSD. She is faculty, senior consultant, and trainer at the National Institute for the Psychotherapy's Integrative Trauma Program in New York City. Dr. Alter-Reid has published articles and book chapters on her work with first responders, therapists, and on clinical treatment of transgenerational trauma. We were talking in the session or the before the session started, and Karen has actually been working in the field of trauma since she was a graduate student, I think in the early 80s or something. So she knows this field inside out. So I think this is going to be a fascinating presentation. You can learn more about her work at www.alter-reid.com. So Karen, whenever you're ready, just get started, and yeah, looking forward to this one.
Okay, thank you very much, Niall, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's morning here in Stamford, Connecticut. As you could tell from my accent, I am a New Yorker. And I, got very interested in the last few years about the whole realm of transgenerational trauma, and we knew that people struggled with transmissions from generations before, but really kind of was a head scratcher in terms of how do you treat trauma that's been transmitted, and from trauma that's not from your own lived life experience, which is what I've been spending most of my career is, about traumas, whether they're acute or chronic, from one's own lived life. So this presentation will focus some on what we seem to know so far about transgenerational trauma. I myself am specialized in doing a psychotherapy treatment called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So I'll mention that a little bit, but for the therapists who are out there, you can do the kind of treatment, the ideas that I'll be throwing out in the latter half of the presentation, just adapt it to your own modality of treatment if you're interested in working in this way. So there is or has been a growing body of research and interest in the fields of epigenetics, which is, the transmission genetically through the generations, and on neurochemical reactivity, what's happening in the brain and body that causes these transmissions from one generation to the other. There's been some focus on how one passes down cognitive and emotional traits, and about how things might get transmitted unconsciously. And there's been a good chunk of growing research on the correlations between a parent having post-traumatic stress disorder and the next generations, even if they weren't exposed to the type of stressors that their parents were exposed to. So we're just going to differentiate here between direct transmission and non-direct transmission. In direct transmission, children just learn to behave and think in disordered ways similar to those of their parents. So, it happens by learning and being in direct exposure to parents' way of being in the world as a result of their or their ancestors' experiences. And, this does result in higher rates among the children for the very same disorders that the parents suffered from. Now, in non-direct transmissions, it's postulated that the problems of the children are due to the parents' disorders, but not through direct modeling and learning, but rather that the disorder caused the parents to have difficulties in parenting, and that their disorder then caused global deficits in the children. that's the direct and the indirect. One is through modeling, and one is through because of the results or the consequences, rather, of trauma to the parents, that would cause them to parent in a certain dysregulated way, which would affect the children. So basically, we have our brains, our bodies, our souls, but mostly our brains focus today is we have a very efficient neuropsychological capacity to learn emotionally during heightened times of interactions when there's either a high degree of stress or a high degree of other emotions, that we learn much more quickly and in a much more entrenched way when things are happening at a high emotional pitch. We have a high capacity neuropsychologically to identify with our caretakers, and we also have very strong empathic systems that are hardwired in, that they all prime us for intergenerational transmissions. We're locked in, we have intense interaction with our caregivers, parents, grandparents. We're empathic, we identify with them. And so that's one hypothesis. So that when we identify when traumatized parents are dysregulated, and we'll learn more about that as it unfolds and what the manifestations of that dysregulation are. They're usually held together by very strong emotions, if there's transgenerational trauma, of panic or terror or helplessness. So these are the affects that are usually most associated with transmissions. Transmissions are just inevitable. There's nothing you can do to stop them because of our neurobiology. And a lot is conveyed through nonverbal emotional communication and the emotional atmosphere around the child. Oftentimes, people with generational trauma who've been exposed to genocides or very inhumane treatment end up to have themselves a sense of dehumanization. Then it's called internalized dehumanization, that they've kind of taken in the way they've been treated, and that gets passed down, that tendency to dehumanize oneself. So the transmissions are not just the trauma itself, but also the adaptations that our parents, grandparents, ancestors made to those states. So oftentimes the way to survive war or being threatened is to dissociate. In dissociation, one just it's again an innate capacity. When you can't fight the threats and you can't get away, then the next thing that the nervous system does is to dissociate, and that is to basically leave the body and look on at what's happening, as though what it does is it provides the capacity to feel that it's not happening to me, it's happening to somebody else. Other forms of dissociation are not just leaving the body, but viewing the world as not real, like this isn't really happening. One can also dissociate from strong feelings of terror, dissociate even from the knowledge of what's happening. So it's really a built-in hardwiring capacity to cope with extreme trauma. It's very adaptive at the time. It helps the person get through. But if it becomes a primary way to deal with threat, then the dissociation actually gets transmitted also. So it's not just the trauma, but it's the way one coped with the trauma that gets passed down. So essentially the premise here is that what has not been embodied and regulated, and what has not been narrated coherently to the next generation leaves the child to grapple with the deposits of the trauma or the story of the trauma and its attendant responses to these conditions. So, we're going to look at what happens when somebody embodies and learns to regulate their trauma, and what happens when one does not have that opportunity to really digest and metabolize what happened to you. And it's in those cases that the transmission occurs. Narrative will become very important as we talk, because really ultimately what we want to be able to do is hand down to our children and our loved ones and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren a coherent narrative of what has come before them. And unfortunately, when trauma is not metabolized or regulated or embodied, there's not a clear narrative, and narratives are very important in terms of coping and how one takes in information. So what have we learned so far about transmissions? The epigenetic research, many of you might have heard of Dr. Rachel Yehuda here in the United States, who studied she studied Holocaust survivors, and she studied mothers who were exposed to the to 9/11, to the towers falling when they were pregnant, and then comparing the offspring of survivors and of the babies of the people born to those exposed to 9/11, and found that the cortisol levels, which is biochemical agent in the body that's responsible, that is part of the stress system neurochemically, that babies are born with higher cortisol levels when the mother was exposed to trauma during the period of pregnancy. What it means when you're born with higher levels of cortisol is that it makes the body much more reactive to stress. And you can also think of it as just a narrower bandwidth for tolerating stress. So if you're born already with that predisposition, you're much more likely to end up with trauma-related symptoms. So that's from an epigenetic research. And by the way, that research has gotten extended in the past several years. And it's not the cortisol levels and the genetic expression is not just happening when the mom is pregnant. It could be anything that happens during her lifetime and the father's lifetime, because of course that also affects genetics. So, in the family systems models, what they talk about in terms of transmission are destructive scripts being passed down, ways of viewing the world is not safe. You can only trust, we can only trust one another in the family. At any moment, something bad could happen. Now, sometimes that's very true, but when you're passing it down to people where you've lived that way, but they're not under those, living under those conditions, then there's a passing down of something that doesn't really match the reality, and people have to adapt themselves to integrate that into their perceptions of themselves and others. Oftentimes there's a lot of very deep invisible loyalties to one's ancestors, where it's almost it's unspoken, and it's rigid, so that it's like loyalty at all cost, as opposed to what you would think about, fealty and loyalty as positive traits. So there's, if you're interested in looking up the research, there's also a lot of second and third generation research where there's very, very powerful correlations between parental post-traumatic stress and the next generation. The psychoanalytic writing, and that's the modality of treatment and thought that originally impacted my career. What they talk about and write about is growing up in a transgenerational atmosphere when parents and grandparents have not been able and afforded the opportunity to work through their own trauma, such that children growing up in this atmosphere have a difficulty distinguishing, actually, between what they're going through and what their parents are going through, that it all kind of ends up getting into one pool. And they call this the we-me states. So this is just a graphic that just expands the view of how, of the epigenetics and the transmission of trauma, where you see that the ripple effects of trauma just pervade not just the individual, but the family and the community and the nation. And you can start from any point on this diagram and just see the ripples throughout. But, at the national level, just political disempowerment, and how with massive trauma, there's just could be a loss of collective identity when a whole population is trying to be wiped out, and that how that affects the community, and it ripples down because of that stress to helplessness and grief, a lot of times not being able to metabolize or express grief, so that it's kind of log jammed in there, and that how that ripples down to low self-esteem and a whole host of mental health problems. And here at the bottom, the epigenetic regulation of the HPA axis, that's the biological areas of the brain that refer to the HPA axis that are very implicated in the stress response in us humans. I just wanted to point this out just to expand a little bit about the family systems theoretical model in terms of, their angle on transgenerational trauma is that parents who experience trauma-related distress may not be able to support their children in coping and making meaning around those events or events in their own lives, because meaning making is ultimately what us humans try to do as we try to metabolize what's happened to us. And if one's own traumas have blocked that capacity to make meaning, and it's totally a brain thing, it's not a pointing the finger and not being able to do or express what's happened. It really just has to do with how experiences are stored in the brain. And traumatic experiences, when things happen under conditions of very high stress, those experiences often get stuck, really quite literally. If you look at MRIs and fMRIs, the limbic structure, the emotional brain, is very lit up. And the part of the brain that can think clearly and organize and store information in categories is not able to come online during those high trauma, high stress events. And so it can help to metabolize and make meaning of the events, because what happened is just stored in a separate area of the brain without being able to crosstalk with all the other experiences. And Bert Hellinger, who studied intergenerational trauma, said this beautiful quote, I think that kind of holds it all, that any difficulty or entanglement that happens in a family system is based on where love stopped in the family soul. And love can stop with death, with tragedy, with violence, war, illness, and disease. And here we're talking about all of that and how it impacts. So it's not love the way you think about love, like people stop loving. Of course not. But the expression of clear love often is obscured. Just back to research a little bit so that that some big mental health associations have endorsed and recognized and generational trauma, calling it historical trauma. We see it here in our indigenous populations in the United States, with African Americans who had been slaves for generations and lived through systemic racism and continue to do so in many cases here in the US. There's literature you can look up on the Armenian genocide, on the American Japanese interned in the US. Of course, I have reporting to you a lot of the research on US-based trauma. Also the survivors of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And really, there have been research with all of these atrocities and looking at how the transmissions affect the offspring. Here, I just wanted to point out that when there's a history of interpersonal trauma, so that, of course, what's meant by that is that there's interpersonal, somebody is doing something, the trauma act is perpetrated on one in a very personal way. You are lower than, you don't get to do this. And when there's human perpetrated violence, it has the added distinctly different aspect of malevolent intent, which really can lead to enormous shattering beliefs about the self and the world and the safety and security, and a sense of internal agency that one can bring forth into the world. And this is called malevolent trauma. And it's not hard to really conclude, it's kind of common sense, but there's research to support it, that the levels of PTSD are much higher in victims of political violence than in disaster studies, like environmental disasters, earthquakes, fires, etc., that don't have that interpersonal element and malevolent intent. These are just, they're bad things that happen, but they're not with intent to wound and to hurt. So post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. Joy DeGroy has talked about and written about African Americans and their experiences of the legacy of trauma. And she categorizes that there are three categories of the impact of slavery. And one she calls vacant esteem, the state of believing oneself to have little or no worth in society, community, or family. The second category is ever-present anger, just this wellspring of anger lying under the surface due to ongoing frustrations and blocked goals. And that the adaptations, as you recall, I mentioned that a little bit earlier about, well, what do people do with what's happening to them? and that a major adaptation is suppressing aggression and assertiveness. So just kind of being right under the surface and needing to squash down the anger in response to that. What's happening is so wrong. And the third category called racist socialization, and that's taking on the views and attitudes of one's captors. And, with slavery, that would mean adopting the white version of the American dream, where white is beautiful and shades of black and brown are inferior. So it's an internalized racism. The most research we have on transgenerational trauma is on Holocaust trauma transition. And what's described is, and it's very generalizable and applicable to other populations and cultural variants with experiences of generational trauma. They describe the dual reality of the children of Holocaust survivors, where they seem to have an experiential knowledge of an event that happened before they were born. It's like they can describe to you that they could feel as though they lived through it. And the experience of two realities, the here and now, what's happening now in their lives, and the trauma before. And children of survivors see and reference the two, and depends what's foreground and what's background, depending on the conditions at the time. But that each reality can really dominate the psychological space, so that if you're in that space of the reality of what happened before, people are left reacting in the present as though that's happening now. In the reality of the Holocaust and other genocides and horrific atrocities, every move could be the wrong move. You were saved because you were the first in line. You were saved because you were last. You were alone. That's why you were saved. You were saved because you were with others, because you were on the right, because you were on the left. So, oftentimes there felt like there was no rhyme or reason for why it was happening, which just leads to a lot of confusion that can also get transmitted. And that often there's the feeling with survivors, second, third generation, that everybody is a potential perpetrator around you, and that including oneself, that the capacity for hurtful, dehumanizing behavior is everywhere, included in the self. And of course, the indigenous trauma in our country, the historical losses of land, of population, of children, of whole cultures and traditions. These traumas get passed down as well. Because the healing processes that underlie the observed effects of family milieu are malleable, they're changeable. Survivors and offspring suffering might be reduced through efforts to recapture meaning, purpose, identity, connectedness of past, present, and future, and attachments to community and place. And this is from the work of Yael Danieli, who has a seminal text on intergenerational trauma. So what she's saying is, if we can help people create meaning and purpose and really connect through past, present, and future, and create, help to create lasting attachments to community and place, that can really work to offset suffering and to move people forward, and without the continual drip of the transmissions. So in the remaining half hour today, I will talk about clinical manifestations. How do you know with your patients that to start thinking about whether some of the symptoms are created by transgenerational trauma transmissions, and then how to open up the treatment to explore generationally beyond just history taking from one's own lives. And so I'm going to introduce to you this concept of when to start asking more historically based questions and help you and the patient get to know not only their lived life landscape clinically, but their ancestral landscape as well, to look at what themes that are being brought forth in the patient's life that are obstacles, feelings of defectiveness, feelings of powerlessness, might not be just from one's lived life, but ancestrally. And if that's true and they've been transmitted, how do you treat that differently? I've begun to use music and art in the treatment and integrating that, as well as my primary treatment modality, which is EMDR. I'm going to skip a few slides here, but I just want to tell you, because I know that maybe a few of you are EMDR therapists, and some of you may not be aware of what EMGR therapy is or how it works, but it is a trauma treatment, and it's based on the premise that the brain is hardwired to bring experiences to an adaptive resolution, and that it's just moment to moment our brains are associating and time tagging and pruning, meaning there's a hardwired capacity to hold on to what we need, that what the brain is hardwired to kind of look at as what we need. And most times that's about survival, what we need to survive, and what we can let go of, so that we're not cluttering up the brain so much. And so our much like if we get a cut on the hand, or piece of glass cuts the hand, sometimes you need to put a Band-Aid on, and then the body will take over to heal it. Sometimes you have to put on special medicine, sometimes just air, but you do a treatment, and then the body kind of comes into what it's going to do naturally, the natural capacities for healing. And the brain has that same kind of capacity, that it will, left unfettered, be able to bring things to their own adaptive resolutions and to heal pain and painful experiences. But what happens when we're under conditions of very high stress, the neurochemicals that get secreted into our systems, adrenaline, norepinephrine, vasopressin, these stress hormones are just literally bathing the brain, and they interrupt that innate capacity for healing that takes place in the brain. And so with EMDR therapy, we look for the experiences and memories that haven't had a chance to go through the innate information processing and healing system in the brain. And we need to locate those memories that are driving the symptoms and get them accessed, and then help them resume movement through the brain to crosstalk with all other life experiences and to make the most meaning. So when one is traumatized or has memories that are log jammed in the brain and haven't had an opportunity to move through the brain, when you get triggered, it's because something is happening that has components of memory that are similar to the memories or experiences that have been log jammed. And at that point, there's a past-present collision, and the person reacts as though it's happening to them. So from this perspective, we have to wonder, because we see it on MRIs and fMRIs, how we need the activation of both hemispheres of the brain, the cortical region and the limbic emotional region, to crosstalk in order to metabolize and integrate and make meaning. So we have to just start to wonder. We know one's own lived life experiences are stored, um, and if they're traumatic, they're not integrated. They're sitting in their own little state-specific form in the brain. What about these memories of our ancestors? Are they in there somehow? Do we not know yet where they're stored, how they're stored, in what form they're stored? But I began to take the premise that they're stored somewhere, just because of the research and what we see in terms of the manifestations. So I'll talk a little bit about that more later. Let me just go back to this one. In general, if you're working with somebody with trauma symptoms and they are not making sense to you as a clinician based on the history and clinical landscape that the client is describing to you, you really should just go back and ask them if anybody else in the family has the same symptoms as them. Could be that they just can't trust and therefore can't find their way into a meaningful relationship. A time when one of your parents has experienced that sense of lack of trust, a time when one of your ancestors might have experienced that you may know through history books, or that you may know through stories, or a time that you heard a generational story. Or even asking about what's the worst trauma, not just in your own life, but in the history of the family. And this way we begin to widen the scope. Before I just go into the next session, what I want to invite you to do, because what I found in doing transgenerational work is not only does it help heal ancestral trauma, but it also helps people to recognize and start to affiliate and internalize resources from the generations that they hadn't thought about, or that they've been taught to reject, or they haven't been told about. So, we've all been through the pandemic, still living through it. We all have unique reactions to it. If we look at that, which it certainly is an ongoing traumatic event in our lives. This isn't about reading now about the Spanish flu of 1918. We're living through it. And so if we just stop to think about really what our adaptations have been to it, what, how have we reacted, what strengths have we brought to this? And because transmissions are inevitable and unique to each of us, our reactions can be reflected upon generationally. So after looking at what we're telling ourselves about ourselves during these times and about the world around us, some of us are feeling very unsafe or fed up or powerless. How is each of us making meaning? How are we coping through it? Are there things that are mitigating our distress? What have you, your family, your community done in response to this threat? And then to turn your attention to crises that your ancestors faced. What stories, narratives do they have about their trauma? And how have their community, national, tribal narratives been integrated in your own response and narrative? And then taking a moment to just think about, what are you drawing upon through this crisis that are generational resources? For some, the narrative is, we go through hardship, we persevere, we get through, then we join in celebration. For others, there is no narrative. So, because narratives are important to listen to, I just want to review that quickly. The personal narrative is the story that the patient tells about what they've been through, and the manner in which a patient tells the story is diagnostic and helps reveal and identify the trauma. So, is the narrative coherent? Is it disruptive? What's the emotional quality? What's the content? So, that's a personal narrative. A communal, national, a tribal narrative. Some people will be able to tell you, some of your patients, if you ask, what are your identifications with what's come before you? And some of them have stories and connections, and some don't. Stories haven't been told. But when they do have a story and it's about a crisis or trauma, it's very common to have a tribal wound or a struggle or a threat, plus the response to that threat. This terrible thing happened. They were trying to kill us. We developed an underground, try to get people out. And the response to the threat may lead to ultimate triumphs and lessons learned, or the threats may be ongoing. In terms of being able to contain trauma on an individual level, if a parent has processed their own trauma, including grieving and regaining mastery in her life and gaining the capacity to share those experiences in a regulated way, that creates a safety net for the children because the parents already did their own work. But trauma can also get contained at a community or national level when communities come together to support each other and to try to explain, why did that happen? How did it happen? What did we do? And when communities come together in collective attempts to take measures to prevent further assaults on its members. Here after 9/11, we had the different color alerts to know about, how safe it was to go out, our code red, orange, yellow. So that's an example of, trying to help people with knowledge to create more safety. Also, when communities come together for collective grief and attempt to come to terms together with the tragedy, that's very powerful. When people come together with movements such as Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, really trying to make sense and take action. And trauma can also get contained by memorializing events through rituals and museums. What we're aiming for ultimately is that stories have a pre-trauma, like what was going on in the history of this family or our community or our tribe before the trauma started, what happened during the trauma, how long did it last, how did it get resolved, and what are we hoping for the future. So the 3 dimensions of time are very important. At a tribal level, trauma can get contained as well. And ends, one of the end results can be a narrative of the event for future generations. And the narrative will contain or help or heal the trauma and define who we are. In the Passover Seder for Jews, there's the narration every year over and over again, ritually, bringing the family and the generations together to tell the story of the enslavement in Egypt and the redemption story and the story of going from slavery to freedom. And, an abbreviated version of that tribal narrative is, we were persecuted, we survived, now let's eat. So having a community or a tribal narrative can help to sustain or mitigate the personal trauma. So people who are struggling with trauma in their own lives that's not transgenerational, but have a community and a tribal narrative from their ancestry to be able to hold on to, really seem to have an easier time, something that makes meaning in their lives. And those who don't identify with a tribal narrative may find themselves without a safety net unless they're able to construct a new one. So, the hope is the establishment of a prideful identity within the generational narrative. And, the return, a lot of people are doing it by returning to their roots and really learning more about their family history. And, okay. So people who are, who have digested trauma. So if you're listening through a clinical lens at your patient, to your patient, when they're telling you stories or telling you what brings them there, the story just makes sense. It's descriptive, it's cohesive, it could flow without undue ruptures or interruptions or blocks. And it feels like they've made meaning out of what's happening to them. It's also relational, like you feel like they're talking to you, and not just, it could be anybody in the room and it's one long description. I had a patient who was able to escape from Russia, the family, after being persecuted there. And when she first came into treatment, it was just like one long narrative. Oops. Sorry, something happened with the slides here. Oh, she just, there was no time dimensionality. She would talk about something that happened here in the United States, and how she felt persecuted here. She would talk about an event from 100 years ago. She would go back to her child being bullied at school. And it was very choppy. I had to keep stopping her to ask her, to take a breath and tell me. But it's sort of just, there's just a web of trauma in the brain if the transgenerational stuff hasn't been metabolized. And that's one way that you can start to raise your eyebrow and say, I wonder if there's transgenerational stuff here going on. Okay. With people with a disrupted narrative, it's choppy. It contains a lot of gaps and I don't knows. You ask them something, it says it doesn't matter. They have a symptom and they really just have no idea where it came from. Sometimes they have unaccounted for blocks of time. And the therapist might have to work very hard to define the symptom. It's not really clear. Now, why do these disruptions in narrative happen? It's because traumatized survivors of mass catastrophe have difficulty sharing their experiences because they want to spare their children pain and shame. They have significant dissociation due to survival needs. And this causes repetition. They tell the same stories over and over again. Sometimes they don't share anything at all. They themselves can't make meaning of their experiences and feel overwhelmed by their emotions when they think about it. And that they feel that putting their experiences into words would diminish the magnitude of the harrowing experiences that they went through. The other thing to listen for is a lot of times people will talk about dreams or flashbacks that they're having of war or mass trauma or events that they never experienced. They allude a lot to family secrets, and that they have an unaccounted for hypervigilance, like always looking for danger, or they've really checked out of their own lives. They've really completely dissociated. So because of time, I just want to get to some video to show you, because what I do when I hear the disrupted narratives, the choppiness, the lack of containment of the trauma, and start to suspect that there's transgenerational trauma, I use a generational genogram to see if there, what kind of themes there might be in the history, and to start to gather stories, and to really understand how the patient metabolized their own history. So, you know, I'm through these generational questions, getting not just the information about the history and what they know, but to describe their relationships with their parents and with their grandparents. Here, I'm just sifting through. Just bear with me. What messages they learned that were sent to them by their parents or grandparents. What messages were passed down that included a sense of joy or pride, whether money or food played a significant role in the family, how families handle illness, traumas that families witnessed or experienced, and also just starting to ask what was happening in their community or in the country at the time that the trauma, um, the ancestral traumas occurred, because we want to, be able to fill in history. So many times things are passed down in little bits, and as I, mentioned, they're choppy, so that you can't really get. We need to have like fuller information and a wider scope. You also ask about family pictures or albums that are meaningful, or if they don't have them, the absence, and really asking very directly if they can think of any family or communal or tribal or national stories or rituals or tales of survival or tales of helping others to survive. And, from these questions, sometimes you start asking, and you really end up getting information that were you not probing in this direction, you wouldn't be able to contextualize the person and their ancestral history. And so you're really looking for patterns and for ways to work with this. So just by starting to ask generational questions, you can start to dissemble the dissociation and the implicit demand to wipe out the past, which is often the case. It can promote reflection and the beginnings of integration, make secrets and dark spots visible and coherent. It can help the patient start to re-regulate as they fill in their story and reflect on family patterns and themes, and to begin to develop their own ancestral narrative and embed themselves within that. So I'm going to just talk about, show you a few slides on patient Renata. She 67 years old, and she was raised in communist Poland post World War II. She was born to a Holocaust survivor father and Catholic mother, whose family hid Jews at the start of the war. And she
One is from Emma Harrison Thompson. Emma says, I'm interested in the suggestion the experience is stored in the brain.
yeah.
In recent years, through EFT tapping, I have been aware I hold a physical feeling of true deep sadness in my torso / core / heart / gut, and not my brain. And that she sees clearly this as her mother's trauma from prior to her birth, or maybe during pregnancy. We had a clear family narrative of the trauma, and this is a non-verbal, more primitive narrative. What are your thoughts about the gut being the second brain holding this experience?
Yeah, I would definitely. I think there's so much that we don't know. We're still learning about this brain, but the gut brain, I know it has more electricity, more currents, and we just don't know. But there's so much stored in the gut brain. And I think it's just up to science to catch up with what, Emma, you already know that you're feeling. And I could, as Bessel van der Kolk says so clearly, the body keeps the score, and it does. And so when I'm referring to the brain, it's also that, the brain has afferent and efferent nerves that send signals throughout the whole body. And I think the soul and the heart, we're all just one being with everything connected. I think our imagery is looking into the brains, brain now. We can see lit up areas, and we just aren't that technologically advanced to understand more of the embodied body trauma. But it's interesting that you say there's a very clear narrative, and that you could still feel the sadness so much. And I think that, when we say that we resolve things to the most adaptive resolution, I think that that doesn't mean that means everything's okay. It just means that we're not being hijacked by, triggers for it. So deep sadness, I don't know what your particular family history is, but it is. And I think the main thing clinically is it getting in the way? Or are there just moments that you can feel it and contact it in a way? And that's real, that's ecological. Some things in this world are incredibly sad. If you were walking around feeling, the sadness all the time, and just going back to that like psychoanalytic concept of the transgenerational atmosphere, where it's hard to discern what's yours and what's theirs, that would be another story. But yes, in terms of the body holding it, yes, and the gut brain. I wish I knew more. When I was um, in Vienna several years ago, and I went to the Freud Museum, I bought a book called Gut Feelings was out by a German psychoanalyst years ago, and it's on my bookshelf waiting to read. So this is going to be a good reason for me to pick up that book and really, look at what they were even thinking, decades ago about that, before even knowing what we know today, which is at least you can measure the currency in the gut and know. And, there's, for those of you who don't know, the Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory really talks about the actual physiology of the ventral, vagal, and dorsal nerves that do connect the brain and the body, and really looks at it in terms of that one branch of that does originate in the gut brain, allows us to be socially engaged, and that instinct to really connect. And that the dorsal vagal is more for self-protection, which we tilt towards anyway. We all humans tilt towards how to protect ourselves, but about the responses for self-protection, which is to fight or to get away, and if not, to dissociate. So I think Porges's theory, Emma, in terms of gut brain, in my understanding currently, is probably the most current talking about that.
Cool. That's so interesting. Next question. I'm just kind of curious. Since you've started researching this, Karen, have you discovered anything that's really surprised you, or any instances that have really sort of surprised you about intergenerational or transgenerational trauma that maybe weren't mentioned during the presentation? Any kind of things that really went, whoa, like that's...
Yeah. Well, what's been so beautiful is what I've been doing is try, if there is some sense that there's generational loading, to something that's interfering in their lives. And with one patient, I had her because, oftentimes you don't have pictures, you only have what you imagine. And what we do know is that what you imagine is stored. It doesn't have to be that you're working with memories that actually correspond to the details of what happened, but however you imagine it is stored and therefore impacting us. And I've been having people, when they before we start to process that, those memories and imaginings of ancestral occurrences or feelings, I ask them if there's a piece of music that evokes that period of time for them or what they're imagining. And I was just kind of playing with it because I was studying also guided imagery and music therapy 2 years ago, and just so intrigued by the impact of music. And I was thinking maybe music just allows for access to another part of the brain that we just usually don't talk about and put into words. And so that maybe that would help access ancestral history. And, a surprising and powerful moment for me was one of my patients was working about just the enormous reverberations of watching the George Floyd murder on TV and taking that back generationally. And she chose just gospel music and Martin Luther King narratives for it, and just what came up through her body of just the grief of ancestry. And she came from a family, she's very activist, African-American activist here, but she had no stories, her family still didn't talk about it. They were busy trying to protect and get on with their own lives and try to adapt. And just how the music in particular really allowed her to access grief that must have been transmitted and squashed down because it had no context. So that was a moment where I said, "Oh, music, music. Let's use music. Let's use art. Let's use other ways that we process to try to access and work through things." Which I know in other fields it's like a non-issue for them. Of course, they go to art and music, but for me, who's been somebody who's been more cognitive, um, it was just wonderful to have that lesson.
I love that idea that things like music can help you access parts of your memory or brain that you might not have access to otherwise. That's so interesting. Emma just asked a quick follow-up to her earlier question. Could you add the name of the author suggested to the chat, or what was the author's name? Sorry.
Oh, Stephen Porges. So Porges. If you Google him, you'll get a lot articles. Yeah.
And if you search on YouTube as well, polyvagal theory and trauma, and we've done a talk on it as well from Deb Dana, which is
Deb Dana is like a go-to.
Yeah.
So, yeah, definitely watch her presentation. She's so smart.
Okay, so next question is from Alexander Wald. So, is there any research on the children of perpetrators of political or cultural violence, or of people who know they are part of the group that benefited from others' suffering? So let's say someone, maybe an ancestor of people that were in the SS in Nazi Germany, for example, or something like that.
Yeah, it would be such a fascinating topic. And thank you for tickling my brain to think about looking for that. I don't know of any. I just saw a very profound documentary where the documentarian, I think he might have even been British. I got to look it up and get it to you, Niall, the name. But he went in Germany to villages where, people who were part of the Nazi regime lived, and, just try to talk to them. And there was mostly so much denial still and minimization. I think the challenge, there was to get the children to talk about it, but there's been a lot of reconciliation in Germany, and how that is transmitted. I think a lot of times, my best guess is that it wasn't digested or metabolized by the perpetrators. So it's handed down in very non-metabolized form. And you do wonder, that question makes me wonder about whether they're left with remnants of feeling, very aggressive, sadistic urges that they don't know where they're coming from. Or if there's been a deep sense of reconciliation, if they're left to feel like they have to reconciliate the ones. And I think that does happen with generations in Germany, trying to find a way. But the direct transmissions, Alexander, I wish I had an answer for you, but I'm going to write it down for my own edification. I think it would be a fascinating area of research and exploration. And just like with, I started my career with working with incest survivors. And, we know that if you treat the perpetrators of sexual assaults and they stop abusing, and they have their own trauma history that they haven't been able to digest and work through. So, whatever is getting unloaded to the next generations from perpetrators, I certainly hope that one benefit of providing treatment, if offered and accepted, would be to heal those ancestral wounds and deep reconciliative urges.
It makes you think that, I've never heard the term before, but transgenerational shame, the people that experience that, if that is actually a phenomenon,
Right.
they're equally as, I don't know if victim is the right word, but they
No,
they
right.
deserve as much compassion as people that are, because they
Absolutely.
haven't done anything,
They haven't done anything. It's transgenerational. It's not theirs. It's not their shame, but they can walk around feeling a deep sense of shame without a context, probably because there was no narrative that
Yeah.
helped make sense of what happens and why. Yeah. So yeah. Oh, thank you both, Niall and Alexander, for bringing up that fascinating um, uh, area to explore transgenerational shame. It's maybe one of you will work on it.
I vote for Alexandra for that
And
one.
pioneer it, because look, a lot has been written about, because I've done pretty thorough research, but on what, people trying to explain how it happens, but not much about then what do you do?
Yeah.
Then what do you do? So I think, gosh, if it's sparking interest, that's wonderful. Yeah. None of us should be left with these legacies of trauma. We should be free to live our full, rich, authentic lives.
100%. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Karen, we've got a question here from Fenella. I think she's really enjoyed the presentation.
So go ahead.
But she's asked, where would you suggest that she can identify practically everything mentioned in the presentation? She's really glad that this information has been shared, but are there
Oh,
any?
did I send you a bibliography, Niall?
Yeah, we sent out a reading list before. That would probably be the best way to list the resources. Yeah.
Yeah, or if you want to write to me, I'm happy for people to have. I think I put my email address. Yeah, right there on that slide. And I can tell you when presenting, because everything's virtual these days. So sometime in the winter, I'm going to be doing a 2-day presentation, and it's filled with videos of actual treatment sessions. With Renata, I showed you just like a few clips of just to, get your appetites wet for just asking generational questions and how much that opens up treatment. I mean, we spent 2 hours off of just the question of what does your name mean, and what, where did it come from, and what does it mean to you? And I have 20 questions that I ask. So, but if you want, I'm happy to put you on a mailing list for that. And you can write to me and ask me more specifically if you'd like what areas of information you want to delve into more.
Awesome. Well, Karen, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting presentation, and it's such a fascinating field of inquiry, and I just commend you for, I suppose, for the work that you're doing. And I imagine it probably took a fair amount of courage to sort of go down this path. So I just want to say, well done, and keep up the great work. And
Thank you for everybody listening.
And also, I want to say thank you to all the attendees who tuned in today. Again, you're spending your full Sunday listening to a day of lectures for your ongoing development. That's amazing. So I just want to commend you all for that. I want to say a big thank you to our staff as well. Lally has just recently joined the Weekend University. She's in the background. She's just been amazing all day. So I want to say thank you to Lally as well, and everybody else in the Weekend University's team. So thank you all. Karen, if you want if you want to get going now, I'm just going to share some information about our new membership program for anybody that wants to have a look at that there. So it's been lovely to see you, and I'll be in touch during the week to
Okay.
just
Thank you very
finalize
much.
everything. All right. See you soon.